For almost 200 years, the ship of the line was the dominant fighting machine on the seas. Manned by a crew of 850 and capable of firing over 1.5 tons of iron shot in a single devastating broadside, these 18th century floating fortresses were the nuclear-powered capital ships of their day.
It's like an office building with cannon. It's intimidating, it's big, it's powerful, and it is the most complicated thing in 1750.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, these wooden walls, crewed by iron men, fought titanic, bloody battles. The largest fleet actions in history. Battles that would crush and create empires. Using color reenactment, Battle Stations goes below decks of the age of fighting sail's most famous warship. Her name is Victory. October the 21st, 1805. Trafalgar, 40 miles west of the Rock of Gibraltar. 50,000 men and 60 warships engage. The greatest sea battle the world has ever seen has begun. No quarter is expected. None will be given.
They were such grim, desperate, savage, brutal battles, and the chance of surviving them was, 1 in 3 if you were at the front of the line.
Napoleon Bonaparte, the French tyrant of Europe, has commanded his Franco-Spanish fleet to gain control of the English Channel. But blocking his ambition, as well as his ships, is a British fleet. Its flagship is HMS Victory, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson.
He stands under fire. He doesn't hide, he doesn't shirk from the battle, he leads the battle. So Nelson's job is to reduce the battle to a melee of ship on ship and leave his men and Victory to do what they do best: close in, finish off, destroy.
But the story of HMS Victory begins nearly half a century earlier, during a period of conflict known as the 7 Years' War.
In the 1750s, the British and the French are vying in Canada and the Caribbean for control of the wood and the fur resources of Canada and for the sugar resources of the Caribbean. There's a lot of money at stake in the 1750s, and Britain and France are fighting over it.
For over 400 years, Britain has relied on its navy.
Britain is a maritime trading nation, and that means in order to ensure that British merchants can go all around the world and make all the money that they want, they need ships to protect them.
These wooden walls form the country's first and most important line of defense. In 1759, with this latest war against France, Parliament ordered the construction of 12 new ships.
Unlike any previous war, we were now fighting on 4 different continents, and therefore the Navy needed to supplement their fleets with a considerable number of vessels to fight on these various fronts.
In the late 18th century, the most sophisticated warship any navy could possess was the 100-gun, first-rate ship of the line.
In 1750, nothing is more complicated than a sailing ship, and no sailing ship is more complicated than a ship of the line. And the biggest ship of the line in the Royal Navy is a 100-gun first-rate like HMS Victory.
In many respects, looking upon it from a 21st century point of view, she is the equivalent of a intercontinental ballistic missile submarine.
The surveyor of the British Navy, Sir Thomas Slade, would design the finest example of a first-rate ever produced in Great Britain. A ship that would take center stage in one of the most famous naval battles in maritime history.
Thomas Slade was a rather ingenious man. He was actually measuring captured French vessels and adopting the ideas into his own designs to improve speed and capability.
Slade's design laid out the basic shape of a vessel almost 230 feet in length, weighing almost 4,000 tons.
First of all, the keel is laid. On this particular ship, it's just under 160 feet long. And then you start fitting the frames which form the ribs of the ship, which extend all the way up to the top line of her hull. Then you start fitting on all the external planking and the internal planking. And in the lower part of the ship, the vessel is subdivided into various compartments.
Over 21 feet in height, and with its wooden walls almost 3 feet thick, the hold of the ship is a warehouse of all the ship's stores and supplies.
On top of this level is the first deck, which is the orlop. Then we come above the waterline and we have our first gun deck. This is 186 feet in length, and it mounts the heaviest armament, some 90 tons in all, of 30 in number 32-pounder guns.
Here, in this cramped environment, in between cannon weighing 2.5 tons each, 350 seamen worked, slept, and ate.
Rising above that deck, you then have the middle gun deck with 28 in number 24-pounder guns. Rising to the next tier, the upper gun deck, you had 30 12-pounder guns. Coming up to the next level, we then actually rise onto the open decks. She has a quarter deck and a forecastle, and above the quarter deck, an even shorter deck known as the poop.
The last crucial element of the ship's design are its 3 towering masts. The foremast reaches 182 feet, the mainmast 205 feet, and the mizzenmast is 152 feet in height. These huge poles allow the ship to unfurl 37 separate sails, an area of almost 7,000 square yards, larger than the surface area of a football pitch. But in the pre-industrial 18th century, producing a warship of this scale and sophistication was a monumental undertaking.
To build a ship like Victory, you need to clear a forest of oak trees. You need to import masses of timber from abroad, particularly pine for the masts. You need to import flax and hemp to make the sails and the ropes. All kinds of materials from around the world have to be assembled in a very large production unit, major British dockyard.
26 miles of rope and almost 1,000 blocks of various sizes were needed for the ship's rigging. Another 800 blocks were needed to work the guns, and each vessel needed numerous spares. 6,000 trees were felled to build the ship's hull, accounting for almost 300,000 cubic feet of oak. Enough wood to clad the Empire State Building 1.5 times.
The Royal Navy of the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars is so large, and it gets through so much material, that it pioneers what we think of as modern industrial production.
When building commenced, the ship had not been given a name. Just a year into construction, the wooden structure taking shape in its dry dock was finally christened. Her name was to be Victory. But by the end of 1759, Britain had gained control of almost all of North America and had all but crushed French ambitions in the New World. The 7 Years' War was effectively over, and HMS Victory was no longer needed. Built at a cost of more than £50 million in today's money, the Royal Navy's newest battleship was not required for immediate service. The first rate that would go on to become the flagship of the Royal Navy into the 21st century spent the first 13 years of her life laid up. But a new conflict on the other side of the Atlantic would see Victory in active service. The American Revolutionary War. With the formal end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Great Britain had doubled the size of its North American empire. But levying taxes to cover the costs of this expansion created resentment in the colonies. With France as an ally, the colonists challenged British rule. The Revolutionary War had begun. In 1778, HMS Victory readied for war. Once a man of war was at sea, she had to be entirely self-sufficient. Before sailing, it was necessary to load a vast quantity of stores and provisions for the ship's survival.
The ship could carry up to 357 tons of water. Then she would carry something like 50 tons of beer, some 45 tons of salted meat, beef or pork, 2 tons of peas, 2 tons of butter, 45 tons of bread in biscuit form, and a further 10 tons of flour. It is probably the same kind of logistics problem of storing one of these ships as it is to prepare a cruise liner for the Caribbean today.
In addition to food, HMS Victory would need a crew.
Any warship of any period is only as good as the quality of the men on board, because every piece of work on the ship requires large numbers of men applying skill and physical force to carry out the job.
The captain was assigned the ship by the Admiralty, and it was his responsibility to find its crew. Some will have joined the ship voluntarily, having served with the captain on previous vessels. But others, a small proportion, would have been criminals who chose service over jail, or those unlucky enough to have been impressed. In times of conflict, when volunteers and recruits were scarce, press gangs would seize and carry individuals into service by force.
The press had quotas to fill, and if you tell a press officer that he's got to impress so and so many able seamen over the course of a week, and he's a little bit short of his quota, well, perhaps a shepherd or two is going to find himself aboard ship wondering how he got there.
Though life on board a ship of the line in the 18th century offered little in the way of comfort, conditions were not as bad as popular depictions would have us believe. A Royal Navy vessel of the 18th century represented a microcosm of British society. Class and the privilege of rank meant that for the officers, life on board a ship of the line was more comfortable than that of the common sailors. In the closed and stuffy environment of the ship's gun decks, the majority of the ship's company was housed. On one deck alone, 350 men would work, eat, and sleep around the main armament of 32-pound guns.
I think there's no doubt that the life on board in the late 18th, early 19th century would be profoundly shocking to us now, both in terms of diet and discipline and work, and even only having 14 inches of hammock space. It's all immensely cramped and uncomfortable and difficult, but it's always relative.
The conditions for the men on board are infinitely superior to those ashore, because the men get 3 square meals a day, they get meat several times a week, which nobody on shore in an agricultural labouring job could rely on. They're treated better than people ashore because they're worth more. The state needs these men.
For the majority of the crew, their diet consisted chiefly of salt beef or pork, oatmeal, biscuits, and occasionally cheese and butter. Hot food could only be prepared at the galley stove in calm weather, and there were no fresh provisions except on rare occasions.
Although the food would be monotonous, it was given in good quantities, and the average seaman then was actually eating between 4,500 and 5,000 calories a day. And he needed this amount of calories primarily because the work on board was all manual and hard.
Crucial to the well-being of the ship's company was its surgeon. By providing medicine to maintain the general health of the crew, he would treat everyday ailments from boils and sores to diseases and the horrific maiming injuries caused by battle. But 18th century sailors would often seek the solace of other, more common medicines: beer and diluted rum, known as grog.
And you didn't get a little bit of rum, you got a lot of rum. And the great big beaker of rum that every sailor got every single day kept the sailor in, to some extent, a perpetual state of mild alcoholic euphoria.
You have to remember that during the 18th century, alcohol was drunk by nearly everybody from a very early age. And the reason why people drank beer was because it was safer than drinking water.
It was believed at the time that a drunk sailor, a mildly drunk sailor, was a happy sailor, and that if it were not for the rum ration, discipline would fall apart in the Royal Navy.
In an environment where lives frequently depended on each member of the crew performing their roles, there was no room for error or insubordination.
On a ship like Victory, it's essential that everybody knows what they're doing. So there are certain rules of good behavior and decorum that have to be observed. Anybody who breaks those rules is punished.
Punishment was meted out swiftly and could be harsh. But in the 18th century, punishments handed out on board a ship of the line were less severe than is commonly believed.
At the same time as Lord Nelson is fighting the French aboard his ships, minor theft is a hanging offense in England. And it is in fact the Royal Navy which introduces to British justice the very idea of lesser punishments for lesser offenses. So perhaps the punishment for theft or buggery or any number of offenses in law at the time was death. On a ship of the Royal Navy, you might only be flogged for it.
For the skilled seaman, the day was governed by a series of watches. Each man would take his turn carrying out the duties of the watch on deck, setting and trimming sails, steering and navigating the ship. The idlers, those that did not keep watches, were called at 5:30 a.m. They would then start to scrub the lower decks with large blocks of sandstone called holystones. And apart from physically sailing the ship, crewmen were also expected to keep their gunnery skills finely honed. Each gun was manned by a 6-man crew, known by numbers to make orders easier in the noise of battle. Number 1 is the gun captain, who aims and fires the gun. Number 2 uses a long spike to turn and raise the barrel and maneuver the gun after firing. Number 3 loads the gun and rams the shot and powder home. Number 4 sponges out the gun, ensuring that no burning powder or waste is left to cause premature ignition of the new charge. Number 5 works opposite number 2 to move the gun, whilst number 6, the smallest and youngest of the crew, often 10-year-old boys known as powder monkeys, collects the gunpowder charges from the magazine deep in the hold.
That crew in itself is just as important as the gun. If they're not in the right place at the right time, then the whole process goes to pot. So, for example, in a Formula 1 team, if the chap with the fuel hose forgets to stick it in and at the wrong time and the fuel goes all over, it all stops. You lose the race, and that's it. If you lose the race in Napoleonic warfare, you're dead. It's as simple as that.
The Victory's gun crews are trained with pinpoint precision and can carry out the complicated procedure to fire and reload their guns in just 90 seconds.
Gun fires, gun is swabbed, gun is loaded, gun is rammed, gun is loaded with ball, gun is rammed, gun is loaded with wad, gun is rammed, gun is run out again, gun is fired, over and over again, like pistons in an engine.
Fighting at sea is a deadly business.
A cannonball of the period is the same concept as a modern depleted uranium warhead. It takes the potential energy of a ball and a big bag of low explosive gunpowder, converts it into the kinetic energy. Mass times velocity is momentum. Momentum hits sailor. Wham! Sailor is jelly. When that much mass propelled at that high a velocity hits the walls of a ship, it goes right through. Those big balls, the round shot, are tremendously efficient at turning potential energy into destructive energy.
In July 1778, just 5 months after she set sail, the gun crews of HMS Victory experienced their first taste of the horrors of combat. The French, who had backed the American colonists in the Revolutionary War, came head-to-head with the Victory just off the coast of France. But the ensuing battle was indecisive, the French fleet slipping away from the British without sustaining any significant damage. But storm clouds lowered over Europe. France's economy had been shattered by the war. As taxes soared, discontent spread across France. Inspired by American independence, the French began their own bloody revolution. The outcome would change the face of Europe forever and present the Victory with her greatest challenges. In 1789, growing discontent with France's feudal government exploded into an open revolt. With the execution of Louis XVI, revolutionary France found itself at war with Austria and Prussia, and in 1793, Britain followed. Britain's navy immediately blockaded French ports. By positioning Royal Navy ships just outside the French harbors, the British could keep the French navy in port for years on end.
This had several advantages. It meant the British were experienced, highly efficient seafarers. They handled their ships with skill. The French and Spanish, by contrast, had no sea experience. And so however brave they were, they lacked the seafaring skills to compete with the British.
In fact, the blockade was so effective that one contemporary witness described the French as being,
for the most part, badly equipped, that a portion of the crews had never been trained at sea, and that, in short, the fleet was not in a state to perform the services appointed to it.
But the French themselves were to blame for the poor state of their navy. Caught up in the bloody turmoil of the Terror, thousands of aristocrats, many of them naval officers, were executed.
If you wanted to really hurt the French Navy, one way to do it would be to take all the officers out and kill them. And that, of course, is exactly what the French government does during the French Revolution.
They removed all of those skilled navigators, seafarers, and commanders, and they had to repopulate the quarterdecks of their ships with over-promoted midshipmen, merchant ship captains, and civilian volunteers. And the result was catastrophic.
To successfully sail a first-rate ship of the line, experience was paramount.
Controlling such a huge, complex, flexible machine requires a tremendous sense of timing, because nothing you do on a ship like that happens instantly. You can't put the brakes on, you can't accelerate. Everything takes time. You have to anticipate everything that you need to do. And the greatest ship captains of this period are not the men with the quickest reactions, but the ones with the best anticipation.
In the 18th century, naval engagements required nerve and skill.
Ships of the line fought in a line of battle, one behind the other. This is because they could only fight their guns on either broadside, yet they could only make progress with the wind pushing the sails, so they couldn't actually fire in the direction they were going.
Though many battles were fought in this way, they seldom resulted in a decisive victory for either side. But a decisive outcome could be achieved by breaking the line.
If you can put your firepower at one end of the line and hit that long lineup hard with all of your firepower, they will go down like dominoes. Every part of a ship is vulnerable from the stern or from the prow. If you can rake a ship longitudinally, the whole ship is lined up in front of you, ready to go down.
With no bulkheads to slow their passage, the cannonballs caused horrific damage the entire length of the ship. James Atcherley, a Royal Marines captain aboard HMS Victory, recalled.
The shot passing through had mangled the bodies. An extraordinary proportion had lost their heads. A raking shot, which had entered the lower deck, had glanced along the beams and through the thickest of people. And an officer declared that this shot alone had killed or disabled nearly 40 men.
On February the 14th, 1797, at Cape St. Vincent, near Gibraltar, HMS Victory faced a numerically superior Spanish fleet on its way to join the French. In the ensuing battle, a young frigate captain, Horatio Nelson, broke the Spanish line and attacked several ships, including the Santissima Trinidad, then the largest ship in the world. By nightfall, the Spanish had been beaten into submission. The British, inspired by Nelson, had captured 4 and crippled 10 of the Spanish vessels. Britain had secured its unassailable position in European waters, thanks largely to Nelson, a man who would later become a legend. In October 1797, the Victory returned to England, where she was refitted and repainted with her distinctive black and yellow livery. She finally undocked on the 11th of April, 1803. The cost of her refit had been the equivalent of another £50 million.
Over her lifetime, it cost certainly 6 or 7 times more to keep in service than she did to build. The perishable nature of the wooden ship makes it an endless maintenance task.
But a new danger had emerged in France: Napoleon Bonaparte. Amid fears that the great dictator was planning to invade, Britain and HMS Victory were again at war. Now, at the turn of the 18th century, HMS Victory, commanded by Lord Nelson, would take center stage in the most decisive naval battle the world had ever seen. The early 19th century saw a brief period of peace signed between Britain and France at Amiens in 1802, but it was an uneasy agreement, and war broke out again in May 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte, the tyrant of Europe, had set his mind on the conquest of Britain.
In order to force Great Britain to do his will, Napoleon Bonaparte is prepared to invade Great Britain. In order to get to Great Britain, he's got to cross the English Channel. In order to cross the English Channel, he has to ensure that his army is not attacked by the Royal Navy in the process.
With his navy blockaded in ports throughout Europe, the great dictator gathered an army more than 120,000 strong in the Pas de Calais. But Bonaparte knew that before any invasion could take place, the Royal Navy must be swept from the English Channel.
Let us be masters of the Straits for 6 hours, and we shall be masters of the world.
The scene was set for the most decisive naval battle in history, Trafalgar.
The biggest problem that the French have in fighting at sea is Napoleon. Napoleon is a master of war. He understands battles, campaigns, tactics, strategy, but he hasn't the faintest idea about the sea.
What Napoleon wants to do is send Admiral Villeneuve out towards America to decoy, to tempt Nelson out westward, away from the French and the Spanish fleets. His entire policy is hanging on the one question of whether he can decoy enough of the Royal Navy far enough away to enable him to shape the battle space for this crossing.
But Admiral Villeneuve, Napoleon's commander of the Franco-Spanish fleet, had encountered Nelson before. Knowing that he was about to pit himself against the most skillful sea captain of the age filled him with a sense of impending doom.
So Villeneuve, in the weeks and months leading up to Trafalgar, says, look, we can't compete with these people. They're more dynamic, they're more aggressive, they're more innovative than we are. In every battle, somebody has to come second, and at Trafalgar, everybody knew that Villeneuve was going to come second long before the battle starts. Nelson knew it. Villeneuve knew it.
Napoleon's plan called for Villeneuve to head for the West Indies, luring Nelson away from the Channel. Villeneuve would evade Nelson, circle back, and join up with the Spanish fleet off the coast of France to take the Channel. But the British were not so easily fooled.
You can't outwit the British at sea. The British understand this element far better than the French, and far, far better than Napoleon. They anticipate his every move. And not only does Nelson chase Villeneuve all the way to the West Indies and back, but another British fleet meets him off the coast of Spain and gives him a beating on his way back.
His nose blooded, unable to rendezvous with his allies, and with Nelson in hot pursuit, Villeneuve panicked. Instead of heading towards the Channel, he sailed into the port of Cadiz. Nelson, on board HMS Victory, decided to anchor 50 miles from Cadiz and ordered his frigates to watch the port. Villeneuve, under orders to sail immediately for the English Channel and believing Cadiz to be blockaded by only a small number of British frigates, sailed out of port and straight towards Nelson.
Nelson understood there was no point fighting a battle that was inconclusive. There was no point engaging in all the drama and cost of a full-scale fleet battle if you couldn't annihilate the enemy. And he used that word over and over again. He said, only annihilation will do.
Nelson's plan for the battle called for the Royal Navy's ships to form into two columns. These two columns would sail at the center and rear of the enemy line of battle.
Nelson's two-column attack on the Franco-Spanish line is designed to cut them into three pieces. His flagship is going to cut the enemy line 1/3 from the front. And the purpose of that is to destroy the enemy flagship, to take out their command and control center, to leave the rest of the Franco-Spanish fleet as a confused mob.
Nelson was the ultimate risk taker. Before almost every battle, he says things like, glorious victory or Westminster Abbey, meaning, you know, he's either going to die a hero or he's going to achieve victory.
On the morning of October the 21st, 1805, 40 miles west of the Rock of Gibraltar at Trafalgar, the two great fleets drifted on a light breeze towards battle. The French and Spanish began to form a line, when suddenly one of the Spanish captains realized that the rear of the line was perilously exposed.
Our van will be cut away from the main body, and our rear will be overwhelmed. Half the line will be compelled to remain inactive. The French admiral will not grasp it. The fleet is doomed. The French admiral does not understand his business. He has compromised us all.
As the two fleets were advancing towards each other off Cape Trafalgar, Nelson famously ordered the signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty."
What he wanted to say was that England can fight. has confidence that every man will do his duty. But the word confides wasn't in the signal book. It would have to have been spelled out. So his signal officer, John Pascoe, says expects, and Nelson says, yes, that will do. But the men know what Nelson means. And the fact that he's taken the time and the trouble to compose a signal to send to them just before the guns start firing, as they're going into battle, has a tremendous impact on their morale.
Just a few moments later, HMS Victory drifted into range of the French guns.
A minute or two of awful silence ensued, and then, as if by signal from the French admiral, the whole van, or at least 7 or 8 of the weathermost ships, opened a fire upon the Victory. Such a fire has scarcely before been directed at a ship.
Fought at close quarters, the Battle of Trafalgar raged in an area just 1.5 miles long and a half-mile wide. 60 ships of the line engaged, the French and Spanish with 33, and Nelson with 27. According to Second Lieutenant Roteley, a Royal Marine officer aboard HMS Victory, the fighting was brutal.
There was the fire from above, the fire from below, besides the fire from the deck I was upon. The guns recoiling with violence, reports louder than thunder, the decks heaving and the sides straining. I fancied myself in the infernal regions where every man appeared a devil.
A midshipman on the Royal Sovereign later writes,
"It was shocking to see so many brave seamen mangled so. Some with their heads half shot away, others with their entrails mashed, lying panting on the deck."
Almost 2 hours after the battle had begun, a single musket shot fired from the rigging of the French ship Redoutable rang out. Though it was only one of tens of thousands of shots to have been fired that day, its impact was the most devastating. The battle that had been masterminded by Britain's hero of Cape St. Vincent had all but been won, but Admiral Nelson lay dying. Amid the chaos of the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson, Britain's hero of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, was fatally wounded. A musket ball fired from the rigging of the French ship Redoutable entered his body through the shoulder, pierced his lung, and severed his spine. As he lay dying, the Franco-Spanish fleet was destroyed. Trafalgar had been won, but the cost of the battle had been high, and British losses were heavy. Almost 450 killed, and another 1,300 wounded. HMS Victory sustained the heaviest losses of any British vessel. 57 men killed and 110 injured. But of the 27 ships in the British fleet, not one had been sunk or captured. For the French, it was a different story. The Franco-Spanish fleet had lost 4,500 men. Nearly 3,000 were wounded, and 17 of their 33 ships were captured by the British.
At the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson sinks enough of the French Navy and the Allied Spanish Navy to ensure that France cannot impose its will on the British at sea for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars.
The Battle of Trafalgar is the ultimate naval combat. It doesn't decide who wins the battle, it decides who wins the war. And that war doesn't mean that the British have to go back and do it all again later. Nobody takes the British on in fleet-to-fleet battle for another 110 years. That's how important Trafalgar is. Nobody would take on Nelson's heirs, nobody would dare. And so for more than a century, the British have undisputed command of the ocean, unrivaled grasp on world trade, which makes them rich and successful.
Shortly after hearing the news of his victory, Nelson died. HMS Victory's company were grief-stricken.
Great God,
a seaman exclaimed on hearing the news.
I would rather the shot had taken off my head and spared his life.
It is the perfect victory for Nelson. He saves the country, and he dies in the process. Not only is Lord Nelson a hero, he's a martyr. Is it any wonder that the British people build a great big stick in the middle of London and put a statue of Lord Nelson on the top of it?
But HMS Victory was nearly destroyed and had to be towed to port by another ship. The repair work to the Victory was undertaken at Chatham, in the dock where her keel had been laid nearly 5 decades earlier.
You have to remember that Victory reaches its finest hour when it's 40 years old. No modern warship lasts for 40 years in the front line.
But by the early 19th century, steam, not sail, would provide propulsion for the ships of the future. Robert Fulton's steam-powered riverboat, the Claremont, heralded a new era of technology. The age of fighting sail would soon be a thing of the past.
Even when she's laid down in 1759, Victory is already a very mature technology. Wooden sailing ships have been around for a long time. Muzzle-loading cast iron cannon as well. And in the same year, James Watt comes up with a separate condenser, leading to the first successful steam engines and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And the irony for Victory is that she will outlast almost all of her contemporaries as warships, but she'll be rendered obsolete by steam power.
HMS Victory made her last voyage into Portsmouth in December 1812. Now 47 years old, the same age as Nelson at his death, she would never again see active service. After such an illustrious and important career, the final entry in her log reads,
"Moderate breezes and snowy weather. Ship returning the remaining stores to the victualling office and dockyard. Signed, P.H. de Moresque, Captain."
More than 150 years after her construction, the Society for Nautical Research recognized that the condition of HMS Victory would soon be beyond repair. The death watch beetle causing untold damage to its wooden structure. A Save the Victory Fund was launched to repair the famous ship and to restore her appearance to that of the ship Nelson had known at Trafalgar.
Nelson himself thought Victory was the greatest ship of her time, but if Trafalgar hadn't been won, Victory's place in naval history wouldn't be what it is today.
Moved to its present location, Number 2 Dry Dock, at Portsmouth's Royal Naval Dockyard in 1922, HMS Victory has, over the last 80 years, been meticulously restored and saved for a grateful nation. Today, HMS Victory flies the flag of Commander-in-Chief of Naval Home Command and remains the oldest commissioned warship in the world, the second being the 44-gun frigate USS Constitution. Open to the general public, the first-rate 100-gun HMS Victory remains a living monument to the courage and determination of those who fought with Nelson during the Napoleonic Wars, the golden age of fighting sail, and of the Royal Navy's finest hour.